and welcome to Coffee and Comics. I'm Todd A.
I'm Taylor Trask.
How are you doing, Taylor?
Oh, it's another beautiful Sunday morning, Todd. I'm down here. it's like with a morning drive too. It's like, how you doing? Like, it's a beautiful day in sunny San Diego, Todd.
Well, did we do, was our last episode the beer and wine episode? Was that what happened?
Yep.
I think it was. We ended up recording at night. Yeah, okay.
It was our late night edition.
Right.
Comics, after hours.
Yeah. So today, we're actually recording in the morning. Are you drinking a coffee?
I am. And actually, this is kind of a bittersweet cup of coffee. It is the last of the Hagia Sophia blend, which is, there's this little coffee shop near Manitou Springs where I am, in the little part of town called Old Colorado City. And it was this beautiful, the building's still there, but it's this beautiful old historic building that used to be, I think, City Hall at one point. But there was this coffee shop that's been there long before I even moved to town called Hagia Sophia. And it has kind of like a Christian bookstore bent to it, but that was never like thrown in your face. It was just kind of there if you wanted it to be there. But otherwise, it was just this really cool, great place to hang out, do work, get creative stuff done. And they had some really good food too. That's some of the best paninis I've ever had. Anyway, they decided about a month ago that after all this time, they just didn't have the energy or commitment to do it anymore, because I think they were running it as a nonprofit, at least a lot of volunteer basis stuff. So they decided to wind it down, sadly, and we had some beans left. They had their custom blend, which was really, really good, and so we have a little of that left. But it's almost gone now. So this is the last of it. I figured it was a special day. Let's get some special coffee, but it's really good. It's it's kind of mid color, not quite dark, not quite light. Really good character, and it's actually I put it in everything. I put it in French press, I put it in AeroPress, I put it in an espresso machine. It kind of feels pretty versatile. So
you described all the color and mids and stuff in a way like that I can't relate to coffee at all. So what is it like? Is it bitter? Is it fruity? Is it a medium roast? Is it a dark roast?
It's medium. It's medium and a little. I would say it's medium and a little fruity. It's definitely not bitter. Just has a nice bright kind of flavor character, I guess, if you want to be all snooty about it. Yeah, it's good. I mean, I put it in an AeroPress, so that usually enhances it even more.
Ah, okay. Have you ever heard of putting eggshells in your coffee?
God, no. What? What?
No, this is crazy. Where did I hear this? When I was visiting my parents the other week, something came up about that, and we were like, well, that's a crazy thing. And we Googled it. And if you put eggshells in the ground, before brewing it, it will actually like cut the bitterness, I guess, a little bit.
What?
Isn't that
now? Do you risk infecting your coffee with like salmonella or anything like that?
Wash the eggshells.
I guess.
Yeah, there was a we followed. I mean, we didn't do it, but we followed a little instruction thing on how you wash the shell and then how you crush it in your hand and drop it in the grounds and whatever. Yeah, very interesting.
Very cool. What are you up to? What are you drinking?
So I'm drinking, I got some Peet's coffee. Do you have Peet's?
Yeah, we have a Peet's here and there.
I think they're a California base, like Northern California maybe. But anyway, I've got some Peet's Big Bang, which is a medium roast. It tells me that it is a vibrant blast of tropical fruit, a smooth medium style. I don't detect that tropical fruit at all.
Yeah.
It just looks like coffee. I was a little, my experiment is always like, how do I make this into an iced coffee? Mm-hmm. And so this is my first several cups of it. I just did this yesterday, and so it's good. It's a good cup of coffee. It's not exactly like what I expect from an iced coffee, but I haven't figured out my recipe yet. But yeah, it's good. This is like if I drank hot coffee, this is probably a good coffee. I see. I've probably just screwed it up by throwing ice in it.
Yeah, but at some point, I'm not an iced coffee fan at all. Like even, the Starbucks pudding drinks that are essentially just like, sugar and pudding and milk and a little caffeine too. Like even those, I'm just like, something seems wrong about it. So I'm kind of fascinated to see you getting more adept at making iced coffee and kind of what goes into that. Cause it's just like, at some point, maybe I'll acclimate, but I'm just not.
No, I get that. And speaking of that, is there even a Starbucks in the Denver airport, by the way? think I was stymied once again last week when I was there.
Is there?
I was looking for my pudding drink.
I know there's a caribou.
There's a caribou there. I think there's a coffee bean or a Pete's, one of those.
And when we're talking about caribou, I mean yuck. Like that's just move along. I'm sorry. Sorry if anybody who likes caribou, but no.
Oh well, I hadn't tried it.
But no, I think there might be. There's got to be a Starbucks there somewhere. I know there's a couple like little indie, no name shops just sort of popped up too. So I don't know. Maybe Starbucks can't crack that nut. I don't know.
I figured that the Denver Coffee Mafia had like a lock on it or something. So anyway.
Yeah. Anyway.
So what we do on this show is Taylor and I each pick. We pick a coffee, but then we also pick one comic book, usually a graphic novel, and we've read it, and then we just discuss it. We don't know what we picked, what the other one has picked before this happens. So it gives us a little bit of excitement, I think.
Yeah.
And anticipation.
Yeah. Well, that said, Todd, what is your pick?
Well, I'm so glad you asked because I although I did not do what you do, which is like text you text me a couple days ahead, like, oh, this week's pick is going to blow your mind.
Get y'all wound up.
But you will definitely appreciate this. I read Terms and Conditions by R. Sikoryak.
Oh, nice.
Yes, which was a gift to me from you. So I thought you would enjoy a discussion of it.
And for the record, not one you had before, right?
Definitely not one I had before.
I was so paranoid about that because I grabbed it off of Drawn and Quarterly's big sale they had last fall or for Christmas, basically. I grabbed a bunch of stuff, but I grabbed that and I'm thinking, it showed up and I was like, I was putting it in the box to you. I'm like, man, does he have this? I just had this vivid image in my mind of you holding it or reading it or talking about it at some point in the past. And maybe it was, I don't know, maybe it was when we were visiting a shop that you saw it or something. I don't know.
And I, of course, we had coordinated on that Black Friday Drawn and Quarterly sale, but we didn't tell each other what we were getting. And I had scrolled past. It was one of those that like kind of lingered in my, I should put this in my cart. Should I not? Because, of course, the first thing I did was add like 12 different books to my cart. And then I had to go weed out like, okay, I'm not going to get to that. And I tried to make the sale count for the big hardcover stuff. That was the way I went into it. So if you have not heard of this, and here's the other thing. Well, let me describe the book first. So it is the Apple iTunes terms and conditions, literally are the text. That is all the dialogue bubbles, all the what scene directions, all the descriptive panels that they are verbatim the Apple iTunes terms and conditions in order, not remixed into a way that would make sense in conversations or anything like that, just straight through. So, but what I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Sikoryak does is that every single page of this is rendered in the style of another comics artist, and they are dead on. And it is just a trip to read this. It is so weird, and even read is probably not the right word for it because much like the actual printed terms and conditions, your eye just starts to kind of blur with the words. Like so in that way, it's almost like he chose a very contemporary lorem ipsum.
That's a great way to put it.
To show off sort of a trip through comics history.
With Steve Jobs as your guide, by the way.
Right, which is, so that's the other dimension of it that's so strange, is that Steve Jobs is prominent in everything. So it's like Steve Jobs is telling you, or the characters in the stories, the terms and conditions. But it's not strictly his dialogue. As I was saying, it's like sometimes there'll be the scene setting or something. We'll have some terms and conditions, but it is. But he's in it, so it's not. It's it's in this just interesting way where it's not a remix. Exactly. It's not. I mean, it's a remix, but it's it's not like I was saying, the words are not repurposed to make a coherent story. The whole story is the terms and conditions.
It's not like there's a narrative and it's like every once in a while they flash to, and oh, by the way, did you know that this content is licensed under European law? Like, it's just the literal text, which brings to mind one big question. And I didn't bother to look at this even before I sent it to you. Did they have to license, do they have to pay Apple a royalty to basically appropriate that? I mean, because it's not like it's fair use in terms of, we're highlighting some of it for, I guess you can make a case that the whole book is parody, but in most cases, fair use is when you and I, maybe we take the words of something to parody it or satirize it, that's covered under fair use. When you use the entire chunk of that thing, and regardless of how creative it is or not, their lawyers still wrote it. I mean, do they get some kind of reciprocal? Does Drawn and Quarterly have to what was the licensing agreement for that, I wonder?
That is an interesting question, and it's not something that so he includes a page of development notes at the back.
Nice. Okay.
And really explains the project, which is itself, it's just an art project, which I think is, one of the things that you and I love about the format of the show that we've created that we like doing is that we're not talking about whatever comics came out this week necessarily. Yeah. We're definitely trying to sort of have this huge diverse group of comics and books that we will have ended up reviewing and talking about. And this is definitely one of those where, there's no story. It's pure art, and then it's art at this different level of comics art. Where it is a meta commentary on the art through the art. And anyway, in these development notes, as far as I've recall, there's nothing about how they legally obtain this. I think it's just fair game, honestly, at that point, because I think he has transformed the terms and conditions into an art project. So I guess, plus, I guess we all agreed to these terms and conditions at some point. So
that's true.
He's agreed to them. I guess he's just reprinting them. So it's like I said, it's not a book you read exactly. So for me, one of the really exciting things for me going through it was playing that game, which I'm sure anyone who picks this up is going to do. Especially because I don't have a what do you want? I'm a nerd's grasp. I was trying not to say the word nerd, but I don't have that super fanboy thing. I'm not that kind of, I love these people, but I'm not that comic store geek that can tell you, what the order of artists on the Justice League, back till the Silver Age or something like that. But I've read enough comics and I've had a long enough history with comics that such an exciting part of this was playing detective. So in addition to how it's rendered in the style of different artists, he is literally reproducing pages from comics. And it took me, because the notes and the index, he does have a reference index of every page that he's done at the end. And all those are cited, as works with their original work. And so I kind of suspected that was there, but I didn't flip to the back to figure it out. I just approached it like, I'm a new reader. I'm starting with page 1. What do I recognize this from? So I had this experience of discovery as I flipped every page, and I would go, and it jumps all over the map. It's from newspaper cartoons. There will be a Beetle Bailey reference or a Family Circus reference, to where there is just a dead on panel from Wilson that you and I talked about a few shows ago. Yeah. And it was in fact one of the pages we referenced in that show. So when I flipped to that page, it was that instant recognition of, that's Wilson.
Nice.
Daniel Clowes' style. And in Wilson, Daniel Clowes has different styles.
Yeah, that's just it.
So he's drawn.
Of all the books that remind me of this one, in fact, I had to numerous times make sure that the creative terms and conditions wasn't Daniel Clowes, because I'm like,
right,
it follows a similar kind of template. Now, keep in mind, Wilson doesn't go through every sort of version of comics history. He kind of settles in on 6 or 7 kind of palettes, if you will, of draw, of sort of context or drawing, and then kind of just cycles through those based on what he's showing you. But this seems like, does it repeat at all any sort of, like when it does a Snoopy reference, does that come back around again? Or when it does an X-Men reference?
No, every page is wholly original in that sense of like,
that's amazing.
Chosen a page from some historical comic to duplicate in its entirety.
And when I'm looking at Google Images right now just to refresh myself, and I mean, the level of detail in terms of the homage is startling. Like, again, he does like a Snoopy one that is exactly like Charles Schultz would have done. Yeah. He does like a Simpsons one that's exactly like the Simpsons look. Like it's startling that he could capture each of these so perfectly. Like, I almost thought this would have been like, we invited the original artist to come in and redo it in this.
Yeah, I did that same sort of that double take on that. Like, is this, wait, did the other artist do this or did he do this? Yeah. It itself is super diverse. I mean, on page, now it starts, like the actual comic starts on page 6. So if you think about it, 2 pages later, he does an Astro Boy page. So a Japanese, I want to say that's Tetsuka, but I'm not sure. But he does a page of that. And so this is at the point when I'm going through, I went in order. And at that point, I knew it was Astro Boy. At least now, of course, I'm second guessing that I'm saying that in public. But and the opposite page is a panel from The Dark Knight Returns.
Oh my God.
So going from black and white 1950s or 60s Japanese manga to 1980s Frank Miller, who's just in a school of his own art-wise, and it continues that way. Like, there's an Adventure Time page, there's a SpongeBob page, so there's super contemporary stuff like that. Like you mentioned, there's a Simpsons page. But then there's like a My Little Pony page that's exactly like it. And then there's Frank Miller and there's Jack Kirby and there's old sort of noir comics and there's like romance comics. And it is like I said, it is a trip through comics history with this lorem ipsum that we all experience as lorem ipsum. We all look at those terms and conditions and just blur over. None of us, it's they look like words with the proper spacing, but we don't read them or contemplate their meaning. And then there's that added element, like you said, of Steve Jobs appears in every page. And sometimes that's really funny because there's I forgot the comic, but it's one of the first couple of pages where Steve Jobs, this was where I couldn't, at the beginning of me reading it, I was like, oh, maybe he turns it into a story or something, It's, who is this? It was Marge's Little Lulu from 1956. And it looks very much like I thought this was like a Nancy and Sluggo thing because Steve Jobs walks up to a young woman who's holding an apple. Apples, of course, prominently featured through, he works those into many, if there's an object that's supposed to be in the panel, he turns it into an apple. So I bet in the original one, this probably wasn't an apple. But Steve Jobs walks up to her and starts shouting in her face. And she's still sort of smiling, and then he's rubbing his fingers together like he's asking for money, and she's still smiling. And then at some point it takes this turn and she gets angry and he's still shouting at her. And then, the last panel is just, she's very angry with him and she's in a huff, Yeah. But it doesn't, once you kind of grasp the project that he just took a panel or a whole page from that comic book from 1956. And I bet those pictures and, faces and, body language is exactly the same in the 1956 panels. He just added in the Apple terms and conditions, and it makes it so weird.
Well, there's another, it's interesting you say that. There was one that I remembered as I was just thumbing through it. I didn't have the luxury of just reading it all before I sent it to you. I kind of wanted it to be a you experience first, but there was one page and I refound it on Google because it was so shocking. There's one where it's Steve Jobs and Wonder Woman from like a 1940s kind of cut of Wonder Woman, and it's funny. Most of the panels, like Steve Jobs is is like, notably angry and just kind of pissed off the entire time. Like just as he would be in real life, he's got that sort of like look of like, what the heck, just that he's not a happy man in a lot of these panels. So he's grabbing Wonder Woman and she goes to like run out the window and he grabs her again, like very menacingly. And he jumps on her back as she jumps out the window. And it's just like, and again, all the while he's like reciting the terms and conditions.
You're right.
She's like actually trying to like, help somebody. And he's like, wait, no. And he's like, shaking her, like trying to tell her. It's really, I know something about that particular page made me just go, oh, I see what we're doing here. It's ways for him to like weave in Steve Jobs and like really like it's homaging just him and all his quirks and personality sort of things that we always joke about. But it's kind of like he's become immortal through like by appearing in all of these panels over the years.
Yeah. But then there's and you're right. He definitely looks intense or angry. In a lot of them, and that's part of that context that Sikoryak chose, because he obviously chose the specific page that he was going to duplicate, and he could probably see like, oh yeah, that action hero that's in this moment, that's going to be the Jobs character. But then there's stuff like in Beetle Bailey, when he does that page, where I don't even remember the character's name in Beetle Bailey. I just remember that was a comic strip from the papers, but it's the sort of chubby, Popeye, I think that chubby character's name was Wimpy or something. It's that guy in Beetle Bailey is the Steve Jobs avatar. So it's not like the sergeant or anything like that, like the angry one barking orders. It's like the kind of doughy guy that's got glasses and, and there's and then in like the Josie and the Pussycats page that he does, Steve Jobs has a smile on his face because of course it's like, I don't know if it's Archie or somebody that he's standing in for, but it's not always that intense, angry character, and that I guess that context is that's just what makes it absurd.
Well, he's
where he chose
John
to put
in the Garfield one too, which really makes me laugh. Like,
oh my God, the Garfield one is amazing.
Because then Garfield is replaced by an iMac.
Yes.
Steve Jobs is there like in the John drawing, but he's got the turtleneck on and everything. He's
I
just
would
so
read
glib-looking.
a whole book of the John and Garfield one
Yeah.
in that style where it's Steve and a Mac. Yeah. Because of course it's so like the expressions, the John expressions are so perfect. And then it's one of those where the last panel was like John just leaves and Garfield's on his own. But of course in this page, the computer's just sitting there on a table alone with like the last line of the script.
Yeah.
It's it is bizarre. It is absurd. And it's just really interesting. Yeah.
Do you think, just in your opinion, is this because I know out there's probably some Apple fanboy who's like, does this make a mockery of what I love? Do you think this honors and sort of is it made with like love or is it made with like malice? Was the guy like, I'm gonna lambaste everything about Apple because who cares?
That's a really interesting question because my answer is neither. It's that's one of the questions I wrote down that I wanted, that I thought would make sense to discuss was like, what is the actual commentary here? Mm-hmm. And then I settled on that idea of like, no, he's just chosen a lorem ipsum that we all understand and a figure that like looms so large in all of our lives. I'm recording this on a MacBook. We both use Mac and Apple products and everyone does, but taken that context, it turns into like, this is the modern, person avatar that we recognize. This is Steve Jobs taking us through the history of comics, but there's so many layers to that. And it's interesting because on the back is a bunch of quotes of, how clever this is. And review quotes and how funny it is and hilarious. And I didn't really find it hilarious. It's because, it's so meta in that way that the humor itself is very meta. It's very, it's sort of a step back from the humor. Like as I'm laughing about the Garfield thing, it's only in repeating that concept of that page that is funny. But you can't really make sense of it when you're reading it because it's just John and Garfield in these different roles as a computer and Steve Jobs, yelling lines of the terms and conditions back at each other. And so it doesn't make any sense. It's not like he put these, made these characters, put them in there and then made it really funny.
I think though, but for me, some of the context is like, it's number one, acknowledging that here's this legal document that all of us at some point or another in our lives have interfaced with. Right. Some more than others. And here's the guy who basically made that a reality, trying to, I almost kind of think of it like, it's like him trying to force us to finally acknowledge what this text is. And every time we flip the page or change our minds, like, I'm going to go read this instead. Like, he finds a way to intrude into that context. And it's like, I almost imagine like the non-graphic novel version of this would be like you and I sitting down watching Netflix, and like we turn on Stranger Things and Steve Jobs walks into frame and goes, "Did you know?" and starts like talking about the terms and conditions. We switch over to House of Cards and like Frank Underwood is like giving his like monologue to the audience, and all of a sudden Steve Jobs walks in the background and just starts talking over him. You know, or Steve Jobs is Frank Underwood. He turns around, you're like, "Oh, there is." It's that kind of not, I don't want to say the word satire or parody. That's not what it is. It's interesting though, because it's like, you're right. It is a method for this particular guy to basically flex his muscles and really give us, a lot of different pieces of history, Well,
and that exactly what you're saying, I think, is the commentary. It's not a commentary about, criticizing Apple or praising Apple. It's just a commentary about how ubiquitous it is, and what a large figure Steve Jobs is. And towards that point, one thing I definitely should have mentioned, I mentioned like the sort of recurring theme of the apples, but and it's funny because I didn't even start looking in the index to check my history until about halfway through, when I just kept getting stumped by them, and so then after that, I kind of went back and checked, but I think there's a panel that I did not verify that's a saga panel, I think. And it's, so there's a bunch of little apples in the background and stuff. But one of the other things he does is he brings in the products. In the Josie and the Pussycats one, Steve shows up in this sort of happy Jughead or Archie sort of way with this big smile on his face, and he's holding an iPad. And there's a Dick Tracy panel where Dick Tracy's, very stern, and he's like, he was drawn with his eyes were just sort of flat lines, and his mouth is just flat, and his chin is flat. So he looks very intense. And then there's like one panel shot of his hand where he's probably holding up a camera or something like that. And he's holding up an iPod Shuffle. And so there's parts where the devices that, Jobs was responsible for show up. And that, I guess, too, is that thing of like that's just in our lives. That's, we don't even know. We don't recognize what other objects Dick Tracy would be holding, because of course he would be holding something like this. Or, there'll be a superhero panel where the iPhone is like his superpower that's shooting light out of it or something, Okay. So, it's fun in that way. But, to me, mostly this is a history of comics. And it's just such an unbelievable piece to see it all together like this, Well,
it's one of those cool things that you and I kind of bond on a lot, which is, we like the big two, and we even like indie series like like a Saga or East of West or Black Science. But I think you and I both get really jazzed up when somebody takes the opportunity to use this medium to just do something cool and original.
Exactly.
Like, this is clearly one of those. Like, it's just like, oh my God, like this, you would almost, I kind of use this metaphor a lot, but it's almost like you could walk into a gallery, like in a museum, and this would be an exhibit. Like just all the pages would be, hanged on the wall somewhere, and you could like walk around. So this is almost like the collected version of that exhibit. Here it is. I love that.
Well, and you touched on something, or at least you reminded me of something that another thing we talk about a lot is how Wilson, for example, is a perfect specimen of this. Like Wilson, Close changes his style through that for the purpose of telling the story. And when you look at terms and conditions that way, it's again sort of mind blowing. I mean, it's like, why is he changing the style? That's part of that commentary of it doesn't. It's not like he's trying to tell the story of the terms and conditions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why does this panel get represented as a superhero panel? Why is this one like a Sunday newspaper funny? You know, why is this one a 1950s and why is this one a 2000s? It's just really intense to start considering all these things that went into Sikoryak's head, like to create this thing. So you're right. If this were in a gallery, it would be amazing. I mean, I could just see each, page framed and on the wall, and you're just sort of walking through this. Like, in fact, I think that's almost how I would want to experience this, is like physically walking into this book, that way. So, but as a book, it works really well with the index and those developer notes. And so you kind of get to the end and realize how you can fact check, if you were like me and trying to test your knowledge of all these artists, or if you just want to see this like myriad of influences that he took. It's very cool.
Now the standard question on this show is we usually try to figure out, is this better in physical or better in digital? Would you have consumed this via like Comixology or Kindle if you had the chance, or do you like the physical object?
I think a lot of times when we talk about preference when we go through that or something, when we consider the question of digital or physical, this one I don't even think your preference matters. Like if you don't get this physically, it's just not the same project. Like this, I don't think will make any sense digitally. Got it. It's and like I said, I'd even prefer a more physical experience of walking into a museum to see this. It is there's no story to swipe through. You don't want to be we talked about this last week when I chose a book that was largely sort of like comic strips that weren't telling a cohesive narrative. But so that actually works really well in a physical edition where you can just sort of flip to any page and read it. And in digital, you're going to feel that obligation to kind of swipe through in order. And that would be fine. The in order thing doesn't really matter about terms and conditions. You could do that, but I just don't think you're going to get the magnitude of how impressive this is, because you can just, this is what I did the whole time I was reading it, was just flip back and forth through older pages and newer pages and then the index. And, that's what you want to do with this. Yeah.
Good coffee table book too. I mean, that's not to minimize it, but it just seems like one of those that you just want sitting out for anybody who comes by to be like, oh, this is cool. I love this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and do you know if it is available in any sort of oversized hardcover edition?
I don't. I know when I got it off of Drawn and Quarterly, this was the only option.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
I believe you're right. That's what I remember seeing on Drawn and Quarterly. So I just was curious. Anyway, I can't believe I even talked that much about it because while I really enjoyed it, I thought because of its nature, it would just, I would describe it and that would kind of be it.
Yeah.
Without further delay, what was your book this week?
Well, it's interesting. The choice I was going to make was going to be very much what you just said. It was a choice, and I'll probably do it on a future episode, but was going to be so kind of disassociative that I'm like, I don't know if I can even get an episode out of this. So instead, I chose a book that was very much an art project.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yours was certainly that. This is absolutely that. It is a super, super duper indie pick and often cited on lists of the 100 best graphic novels, which is where I kind of encountered it. And it is the book Soft City, written and drawn by Hariton Pushwagner. And in this case, published by New York Review Books in 2016. Now, this is an interesting, I'll give you some backstory first. It's an interesting piece because Pushwagner is a Norwegian painter, and he's usually inspired by anti-capitalist pop art. He's kind of like that guy. So he's not a comics creator. He's not like Moebius in that regard. He's basically like just a painter, like museum artist first and foremost. So this was very much a personal art project, and it was written and published between 1969 and 1976, and it was kind of published in a series of of different like newspaper drawings. And I don't know exactly in how it would, looking at it now, I really don't understand how this would have appeared in a newspaper at all. It just seems the way it's executed here seems very, I don't know how you would adapt that in that way. But it's, it came out then, or was published then, and then it was not collected at all until 2008. Which is really interesting because like he got into some messy legal, Pushwagner got into some messy legal snafu with his, was it his agent? Hang on here. I wrote this down. His dealer. So he and his dealer had some big messy legal thing. Apparently the originals, like his original drawings, disappeared in a suitcase in the early 80s. And they didn't reappear again, quote unquote, until 2002. So there was all kinds of like shenanigans going on surrounding this. And then when they published it, Norwegian publisher No Comprendo was the first to do it in 2008. So it wasn't even published in English until 2016 when New York Review Books did it for the US. And I don't know if they did the UK version too, but it's now finally available. So it was kind of like this thing that was, rumored and, spoken about in certain circles, like this kind of like legendary, like lost piece of art that's like, oh yeah, we'll never get to see it. And if you were around at the time when it was kind of published in piecemeal in newspapers, you have some conception of it. But it's really interesting. Very, very indie. I'll set the stage a little bit first. The art itself is very crudely drawn line art. So the whole thing is black and white, drawn, line art, and the only color that appears is the traffic lights. You'll see red, green, or blue, red, green, or yellow. But for the most part, it's just line art. And not, I look at it now and I'm like, I could do this. But what I couldn't do is create this kind of Kubrickian symmetry that he's got going on. Like it very much feels like a indie film and less like a graphic novel. It's very much like there's camera movement, and there's, even though it's crudely drawn, there's definitely a sense of style and symmetry, and just it feels like you're watching mock-ups for a really interesting indie movie. Just kind of you're going through the storyboard, so it's interesting in that capacity. The whole plot and storyline is it's basically, the entire thing's basically a satire of capitalism and life in a modern city, and it kind of goes. Let me pull up this. I had sort of a nice little summary of this. The summary I see in the back, it says the 154-page strip tells the story of a mechanical everyday life in a demolished dystopian modern city. Here the people are move around like robots, and they are observed through a child's wondering eyes. So basically it's a day in the life of one of 1,000 families in this impersonal, oppressive, kind of futuristic military city. And it's there's no central character, so it's hard to kind of describe what it is. There's no central character. The whole thing starts with a slow zoom in of this gigantic apartment complex that just goes on forever and ever and ever and ever. And all the windows, I mean, there's at least 1,000 tiny little windows drawn on this thing. It almost looks like a computer punch card. It just has kind of that monotony, and it zooms in, and you see a baby wake up, and that baby is part of this family, and we follow this family through the course of their day. And the day is very, very sort of homogenized, just clinical, just that kind of like the urban nightmare of like all, thousands of dudes putting on their hats, going into work, kissing their wives goodbye, getting in their cars, driving on these just jam-packed streets, driving into a gigantic parking garage. And some of the frames and some of the pages are just overwhelming. Like you look at this city and you just see, you don't see any sky. You just see windows upon windows upon windows and cars upon cars forever and ever and ever. And you see them go to this work, their job, and it's this menial job. They all punch their time cards in. Meanwhile, the mom or the wife, she takes the kid to daycare, and it's just this like completely homogenized daycare. And she goes about her day, going to the grocery store, and all the while, it's the panels are interspersed with different kinds of just really cliche, soul-draining marketing messages. So things that they're passing either in the newspaper or watching on TV, or it's the back of a box of cereal. The whole thing is just incredibly impersonal. The parents, the mom and dad wake up, And one of the first things they do is they take the pill. They take a pill, and then she's like, "Did you take your pill, dear?" "Yes, dear." "Did you take your pill?" "Yes, dear." Just very, "Time to get up, dear." "Thank you, dear." Just very. It's kind of like what the 1950s suburban lifestyle would have wrought in the late 60s, early 70s. Now this is where it gets interesting, because this was written during that time. I mean, think about the late 60s, early 70s. That's when Monty Python's Flying Circus was being released, when it was being created. So it was that long ago. And this was in Norway, but it's what I find is, as I'm going through this, and I've gone through it a couple times, it's probably more prescient today than it was then. You think about all the people in China that have to go through these very generic, like they got moved off the farm into the city, and now their life is basically this endless cycle of rinse and repeat, and go, with thousands of other people doing exactly the same thing. To a lesser extent, but almost just as frightening, you've got the U.S. economy, where a lot of people do, TaskRabbit jobs, and just kind of go through the motions. And there's sort of like this, especially with mobile technology, there seems to be this sort of detachment for what life could be. And we've kind of a lot of people have gotten put in these systems of life that they can't get out of. And so it's just, this book almost just drives that point home. Like, this is what, when you sort of coast and sort of disengage from life, this is what life will be. So it's a really interesting critique on capitalism and government and systems and disengagement and disassociation. You've got this, father and mother who barely say anything to each other other than like, "Hello, dear. Goodbye, dear. Let's watch TV, dear." It's just completely informal, or rather formal, impersonal dialogue. And there's this baby, and the baby actually starts and ends. It bookends the story. You see the sun coming up, and the camera zooms in. You see the baby. And then it ends with the baby kind of crying. And you're kind of left to wonder, is it crying because it's a baby, or is it crying because it knows it too will have to one day live and breathe this world, this impersonal world? Like, its life has already been chosen for it. And it's sort of, that's a very sad notion. So the whole thing is kind of an incredible art project by this guy, by Pushwagner. And he's done other works since then, but it's really cool to see it finally, to know the story, the backstory of how it, sort of languished for 30 years. And this could have been put out in the early 80s and could have been really transformative, but it waited. We had to see it in 2008. And then again, 8 years later for us to even see it in English. And there's not much that's not as necessary. The dialogue is pretty generic. So even if it wasn't in English, you wouldn't care as much. Most of the pages are dialogue free. So yeah, it's trying to think what else I was going to say about it.
Well, I love that you brought up Monty Python, because it definitely has that loose line drawing feel of Terry Gilliam's animations and illustrations from Monty Python. And this is a really weird reach. But when I was a kid, I had a book of John Lennon's like poetry that had a bunch of his doodles in it. Mm-hmm. And it also looks like that. Like, they would just be sort of, pen and ink line drawings, and, faceless, but maybe with, where the face doesn't have its character, but it just has sort of, here are the eyes and here's the mouth, and this is, and that, can look very simple and childish in one context, but in the pages I'm seeing from Soft City, it works to reemphasize what you're talking about, like this dehumanization of everything, because you're seeing not just one person with an indistinct face, but like 100 of the same face just drawn over and over and over to fill up a page. Is there a story that you want to read sort of start to finish with this?
No, I mean, you do want to go start to finish, because it is a single day in the life of this particular family. It gets hard to remember that, because they themselves get washed up in the milieu of everybody else, and everybody's life is basically the same as everybody else's. So you could almost make the case that you start with one family, maybe you end with another one. You don't even know. I assume it's the same family start to finish, but you could, when the camera picks back up on one guy or one woman again, they could be a totally different guy and woman, and you would just never have any basis for that. I like going back to what you said real quick about Terry Gilliam. It is very Gilliam-esque. It's almost like he read this before he made the Zero Theorem. because there's a lot of
I'm not familiar with at all.
Yeah, Zero Theorem was that Christoph Waltz movie that came out a couple years ago. I think it's his newest one, if I'm not mistaken. But it's got a lot of that similar kind of just, the city of London in that point had just become this, anthill of just people going about their life, like completely oblivious to the pain and suffering of one guy or the dreams and machinations of another guy. Like it's almost like every bit of hope for something better has been completely suppressed and wiped away. It'd be really interesting to take this work and recreate it and have, one person of, in thousands, kind of break through the matrix and try to be more, try to see more. That's what's missing. And we don't need it, but it's like, that's the thing that I think other art would do today is have the one punk rocker rebelling against the system. And there isn't that at all. There's just this like sad kind of just humdrum of everything. One thing I didn't mention is that a lot of this, most of it's giant, single pages. He divides it into panels once in a while, but most of it is just entire splash pages or double pages. So you open it up and you see the symmetry of every car going home at the end of the day, or every car exiting this 1,000-story parking structure. And then he'll do things like, he'll show you a lot of pictures, but then he'll do things like going home, getting out of the car, going upstairs. So it's almost like the commentary bubbles are like the voice of God, like instructing these characters to do what they, to do their thing. One of the creepiest pictures is all the fathers are getting in and getting out of their cars at the beginning and the end of the book, and they're looking up, waving to just an infinite amount of windows in these apartments, and all the moms and the babies, or the moms and the kids, are staring, waving back. And you're just like, how would you know where your apartment even is? Like, it's just like this, every single person waving up and being waved back down to. It's I don't know. It's really depressing, but it's also kind of a warning too. You're like, this is what the world would be if we didn't strive to imagine about, more for ourselves, more for our society. Like if we just sort of went along with these systems that are in place, that, this is what we'd end up being. And again, some of those systems can be literal, like, hey, 1,000 people go to the same draining, soul-crushing job every day. But it could also be 1,000 people open their little phones and look at Facebook every day and do the same things that they do. They're really no different than the people in this story, or rather this vignette. I hesitate to call it a story. It's more of like a vignette of a day in the life, and it's you could repeat it. What's interesting is you could end the book and immediately go back and reread it again as though it's day number 2, day number 3. It's not like, oh, and then next, tomorrow they all go to a football game. It's like, no, this is their life, day in, day out, forever and ever.
Now, I was going to ask you the physical versus digital question, knowing, that I suspected your answer would be physical. Is that the case?
Well, it's interesting because I keep saying that. I need to have something else to segue there. The book itself is bigger than most graphic novels, taller. So it doesn't fit on the shelf quite as well as other books. So from that standpoint alone, I'm glad I have the physical version. But if you have sort of like a symmetry to your shelf space, you're worried about that, maybe go get the digital. I don't know if it's actually available in digital, to be honest with you. I don't know if they've even gone that far.
Well, my only suggestion, when you were describing how you could start it over, is that would be fantastic if the digital edition actually did that. Like you hit the end of the day and then you swipe and you don't even realize that it's still continuing, but it's the same exact panels that you've already gone through.
That would be incredible.
You just have like an endless digital experience.
Just cycle through, it just repeats, and you think that maybe there'll be something new, and there never is.
Yeah. Oh. And then you realize you've spent your life just going through the same thing.
I'm going to say, unless you haven't, okay, let's pretend for a minute. I really don't think it's available digitally, but let's say it was. Unless you had an iPad Pro, the really big one, I wouldn't do it because as I'm going back through, part of the experience is seeing these gigantic white pages and just an infinite amount of windows, an infinite amount of people. You kind of need to be enveloped by the world he's drawn for you. Yeah. The only way for it to really kind of impact you is to have it close on your lap and just feel like the enormity of this world and just the hopelessness that these people will ever have anything else. Like this is their life until they die, and then they'll plug a new person in. and go on. So you kind of need to have that feeling. When he does break it into panels, it's for the more personal moments. So he breaks it into panels when they're in the apartment, or where they're in the boss's office. When he's watching, like they call him the controller. And there's a really interesting panel where, after he comes in for work, he comes in, the boss of this corporation that all these men go to. He comes in, he doesn't have to go through he's driven up in a limo, and he doesn't have to go through all the same rigmarole as those guys, but his life is still just as mundane. And in one page, there's actually the words, "Who controls the controller?" Written there, because it shows him in his little room, and he's been given orders by somebody else to, they come in via some kind of telefax or something, and he's got to process those too. And so it's just like, his life's a little bit better. His wife and child are, in a mansion. He vid chats with them, which for 1969 was interesting. He actually came up with vid chat. Yeah. Which is quite, I actually have to remind myself, this was drawn in a place or a time long, far removed from the society we're in now. But it's just, seeing that kind of play out. But he will break into smaller panels for those kinds of things. And at the end of the day, but for the most part, when it's everybody, it's pretty much just full pages of these scenes. So I think the physical is definitely the way to go. But just be mindful that when you get it, it's going to be a little taller and a little bit misshapen for your shelf.
Well, that's such an interesting consideration, but it also, to me, sounds like you've got that experience with that oversized book that I was trying to describe with terms and conditions, where you actually want to just walk into the art project. Yeah. And what I've seen just from Googling this is that when they released this, they did tour some of the original art through museums, and the images I've seen from those museums are incredible looking. Like you're literally walking into the Soft City and just seeing these enormous panels on the wall. So I
would imagine if in a museum, it would be even more compelling if all the pages were life size, where maybe like an entire wall was covered with the cars driving into the parking structure. So you can just feel like you feel it. And maybe it's that, if they were even bigger than what's in the book, that would be really compelling. So I think the book does its best to try to give you a sense of that or a taste of that. And again, it's this guy's a painter. He's an actual art, like a painting artist in real life. So for him to take that sensibility into a graphic novel, and at a time when the graphic novel didn't even really exist at all in the early 70s. So it's fascinating that he had this kind of vision, this kind of critique on society and culture, and didn't even know that the format he was sort of creating, as the byproduct of what he was creating would go on to be a really important format for this kind of commentary. And so it's just, it's fascinating that it finally came out after all these years. It came out at a time that I think is even more appropriate than before, but this guy could have been a grandfather, a spiritual founder of a really awesome medium. Imagine if this had come out in the early 80s. What, would we be thinking about him in a much different way? Would the name Pushwagner be even more synonymous with graphic novels and cutting edge commentary and storytelling? Like, who knows? Yeah,
so how did you know about this? Because I just, true confession, have never heard of this.
I never heard of it either until I'm kind of a disciple of all those lists of the most important graphic novels you should own, because I feel like as a connoisseur, I should be mindful of those things. And to be honest, most of the things on those lists have ended up being really, really compelling books in my world. And I've slowly been kind of collecting a lot of them. Like Day Tripper, which I might review in another episode, is another one of those. Day Tripper has appeared numerous times, as have like A Tale of Sand, which we reviewed on a previous book, or Kate Beaton's stuff. Like there's a lot of these things appear on these books. So this is a recent kind of addition, and I just looked at the cover, and the cover looked really cool. It's got kind of an 80s Eurocentric vibe going on, even though the inside is nothing like that. It just felt really interesting and cool, and was something that I'm like, oh, I'll give this a try. And everybody kept talking about it like it's a really important piece of commentary on on our world, and it is. And so I'm glad I grabbed it.
Now, where did you get it? Is this the kind of thing that's going to be stocked in a comic shop, or is it you got to go to Amazon?
I grabbed it off Amazon, but I have seen it in a shop or two since. But it is a very avant-garde sort of choice. So you can almost judge the character of your comic shop by whether or not they carry this book. Is it Forbidden Planet in Portland?
Oh, right. We've talked about them before.
Forbidden Planet? What the heck is the name of the... That's not what it is. It's... Oh, shoot. Hang on. It's going to drive me nuts. Ask me a question while I look for this, because this is comic shows. There's a publisher shop in Portland. Floating World. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
Floating World Comics in Portland definitely has this book, because they basically carry every indie thing you could possibly imagine.
Exactly.
They themselves are an indie publisher. So it's if you're that kind of person where, like, you're not going to go into like Mile High Comics, and nothing against them, I love Mile High Comics, but you're not going to go in there and find this book. Like, they're very much more a mainstream store with some, some good indie stuff on the side. But this is definitely meant for a very sort of indie-oriented, art-oriented comic shop. But if you can't find it, definitely off Amazon.
Yeah, and I would say if you're curious, go back and listen to the Todd and Taylor show number 24, where you talk about several Portland comic book shops.
Yes.
That's what I was looking up while you were looking up something. Hey,
if you live in Portland, man alive, you are swimming in an abundance of riches. That town has, and Colorado Springs too. Let me be fair, has a good number of good, solid comic shops and good creators. But Portland is kind of becoming the mecca of just, you could go all day and just see amazing shop after amazing shop after. And again, that episode you referenced has a lot of that. Yeah.
So in the meantime, where can people find this podcast?
Yeah, you can find us online, wherever podcasts are distributed. I always want to say sold, and that's not right.
I know.
Wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Pocket Casts, and hopefully soon Spotify. Our new distributor, Pippa, has a really cool Spotify integration, so we'll hopefully find ourselves there too. And also you can find us online, findusthere.org, and hopefully soon there'll be another website associated with this podcast we can talk about as well, but more on that later.
Yeah, and we're on Twitter and Instagram and SoundCloud and everywhere else as Find Us There. Find Us, or Their network is, that's sort of our parent umbrella of podcasts. So Find Us There is our handle everywhere. Anything you'd like to plug, Taylor, before we say good morning, whatever we say?
I've just recently updated my Twitter handle. It is now by Taylor Trask to match my Instagram. So if you are looking for me on Twitter and Instagram, it's by Taylor Trask.
Awesome. I am at Hey Todd A on those places. So check us out and follow us. And we will see you next time for another episode of Coffee and Comics.
Cheers.